In the kingdom of Umudike, a single accusation could destroy a man and exile his mother forever. When the heir to the throne, Prince Ugonna, is accused of a terrible crime, the kingdom erupts in chaos. But as the gods are called to judge, secrets unravel and betrayal is unmasked. Will truth prevail, or will deception rewrite destiny? The answer lies within the judgment of the gods. The palace of Umudiki stood tall and majestic, surrounded by high walls, adorned with carvings of great kings and warriors. Inside the royal chambers, a storm was brewing, one that would shake the kingdom to its core. Ugonna sat by the fire, braiding her hair, when a messenger arrived. "The king summons you." "My queen," the young man said, his voice laced with urgency. Ugonna frowned, sensing trouble. She had learned to trust her instincts after years of living in a palace, where whispers carried more weight than the wind. She rose gracefully, wrapping her thick royal cloth around her shoulders, and made her way to the palace hall. There she saw Nkem, the second wife, sitting beside the king, her face adorned with false grief, and next to her, Amara, her daughter, was trembling, her eyes red from supposed tears. "What is happening here?" Ugonna asked cautiously. The king sighed, rubbing his temples. His voice was heavy with disappointment. "Ugonna, I have called you here to answer for the sins of your son." Adana's heartbeat quickened. "My son?" she repeated, stepping forward. Nkem let out a dramatic sob.
"Yes, your son Ugonna."
"He has done the unthinkable. He has forced himself on my daughter, Amara." Gasps filled the room. The accusation hung in the air like a thick, choking fog. Adana's eyes widened in horror. "That is a lie," she cried. Amara flinched. She had rehearsed this moment over and over in her head. But now, standing before the queen and her father, she felt an unfamiliar heaviness in her chest. Yet she had no choice but to go through with it.
"He did it,"
Amara said weakly. "He came into my chambers last night and I begged him to stop." The king's face darkened. He turned to the guards. "Find Ugonna now." Ugonna fell to her knees, grabbing the hem of the king's robe. "Husband, you know my son." "He would never do such a thing." Nkem stood. "The law is clear. If a man is caught in the act, his mother shall be banished alongside him. Justice must be served." The words hit Ugonna like a spear to the heart. Ugonna was the future king, the only heir to the throne. If this accusation stood, he would be ruined, and she would be cast away like a stray dog, somewhere outside the palace walls. Ugonna was unaware that his world was about to shatter. Ugonna wiped the sweat from his brow as he tightened the string of his bow. He had spent the morning in the forest with his best friend, Dyke, practicing his archery. The birds sang overhead, the sun cast golden rays through the thick trees, and for a moment, life felt peaceful. "One more shot," Dyke said, nodding at a wooden target in the distance. Ugonna smirked, raised his bow, and let the arrow fly. It sliced through the air and struck the target's center with deadly precision. "Perfect," Dyke whistled in admiration. Ugonna chuckled and slung his bow over his shoulder. "One day I will be king. I must be ready for battle." But before Dyke could reply, loud footsteps and the clanking of metal armor filled the forest. A group of royal guards stormed into the clearing, their faces grim. "Prince Ugonna!" the leader of the guards called out. Ugonna turned, frowning. "What is the meaning of this?" The guard's gaze hardened. "By the order of King Eziobi, you are under arrest." Uganna's heart pounded. "Arrest? What crime have I committed?" The guard hesitated before answering. "You have been accused of violating Lady Amara." Silence fell over the forest. Dyke stepped forward, rage flashing in his eyes. "That is a lie!" Ugonna mind-spun. "Amara? His stepsister? How could she say such a thing?" "This is a mistake," Ugonna said firmly. "I have done no such thing." The guards remained unmoved. "You will speak at the palace. Come peacefully or we will be forced to restrain you." Ugonna clenched his fists. He could have fought. He could have run. But he was the future king. A man who ran from accusations would only look guilty. With a deep breath, he surrendered. "Take me to my father." The guards seized him, tying his hands with thick ropes. As they dragged him away, Dyke followed closely behind. "I will not let them do this to you," Dyke swore. Ugonna swallowed hard. Deep down, a cold fear gripped his chest. His own stepmother and stepsister had turned against him. What else were they willing to do? The palace courtyard was filled with a restless crowd. Their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves in the Harmattan wind. Men, women, and elders of Umudika kingdom had gathered to witness the fate of Prince Ugonna, the only son of King Eziobi, now accused of the most unforgivable crime. Ugonna was dragged forward by the guards, his hands still bound but his head held high. He would not bow to falsehood. His mother, Queen Ugonna, stood at the front, her face streaked with silent tears. Enkem, the second wife, pretended to weep, while her daughter Amara sat with her head lowered, playing the role of the helpless victim. The king sat on his high throne, his face a mask of disappointment and anger. The council of elders flanked him, their expressions grave. "Ugonna," the king's voice was deep and heavy. "You stand accused of violating your own stepsister. Do you deny or accept this charge?" Ugonna took a deep breath and faced his father with unwavering eyes. "I deny it, father. I am innocent." A murmur spread through the crowd. Enkem stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "My king, how can you let him lie in front of you? My daughter suffered because of him. Will you not seek justice?" Amara let out a soft sob, her shoulders shaking. "A perfect act." One of the elders, Chief Uba, stroked his beard and spoke. "The law is clear. If a man is caught in the act, both he and his mother shall be banished. But we cannot act without proof. We must hear from the victim." The king turned to Amara. "Speak, child. Tell the kingdom what happened." Amara hesitated. For a moment her lips parted, but no words came. Guilt flickered in her eyes as she met Ugonna's piercing gaze. But then, Enkem nudged her, subtly pressing her fingers into her daughter's back. Amara flinched and quickly dropped her head. It was at night," she said in a shaky voice. "I was asleep in my chambers when I felt someone on top of me. I tried to scream, but he covered my mouth. And when he finished, he whispered that if I told anyone, he would kill me." Gasps filled the air. Ugonna's chest burned with rage. How dare she? The king's grip on his staff tightened. "And you say it was Ugonna?" "Yes, my king." The crowd erupted in anger, and the elders murmured amongst themselves. Ugonna shook his head. "This is madness. I was not even in the palace last night. I was in the forest with Dyke. Ask him." Dyke stepped forward, fists clenched. "It is true. We were together all night." But one of Enkem's loyal elders scoffed. "A friend's word proves nothing. He could be lying to protect you." Enkem smirked. Everything was going according to plan. The king sighed deeply. He turned to the high priest, who had been silent throughout the trial. "What do the gods say?" the king asked. The high priest lifted his staff. "I will seek the truth, but if the gods confirm Ugonna guilt, there will be no mercy." A chilling silence fell over the kingdom. The gods would decide. But what if they too were deceived? The palace courtyard remained tense as the high priest stood before the sacred Ikenga shrine, preparing to seek the will of the gods. The air was thick with tension. Every breath, every rustle of the wind carried the weight of what was at stake. If the gods declared Ugonna guilty, he and his mother would be banished forever. If innocent, then someone in the kingdom was lying. Ugonna's hands remained bound, but his spirit did not waver. He locked eyes with Amara, daring her to look at him, but she kept her gaze on the ground. Avoiding his piercing stare, the high priest raised his staff, closing his eyes as he chanted ancient incantations. His voice echoed, sending chills through the gathered crowd. "O great spirits of our ancestors, bear witness to this moment. Let truth be known, let deception be punished." The crowd held their breath as he sprinkled white chalk and kola nuts onto the sacred mat. The kingdom's tradition dictated that if a man was guilty, the kola nut would split unevenly. If innocent, the nuts would break cleanly into equal halves. Everyone watched as the high priest lifted the first kola nut and dropped it. Crack! It split into two equal halves. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The high priest's eyes darkened. He picked up another kola nut and repeated the process. Crack! Again, two equal halves. Whispers filled the courtyard. Enkem stiffened. This was not supposed to happen. The high priest turned to the king. His voice was deep and firm. "My king, the gods have spoken." Silence. "Prince Ugonna is innocent." A collective gasp rang through the kingdom. Queen Ugonna let out a shaky breath. tears welling in her eyes. But before anyone could react further, Nkem sprang to her feet. "No!" she shouted. "This cannot be. The gods must have been deceived." The crowd turned to her in shock. The high priest's gaze darkened. "Do you dare question the will of the gods, Nkem?" Nkem's lips trembled, but she quickly regained her composure. "I only mean that perhaps the gods have not heard the full story. Amara has suffered, and justice must still be served." Amara remained silent. Her hands clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her skin. King Eziobi's face was unreadable. "Enough," he finally said. His voice was heavy. "The gods have spoken, but there is still a mystery to be solved." He turned to Amara, his eyes sharp. "If Ugonna is innocent, then who truly hurt you?" Amara froze. Sweat gathered on her forehead. Her mother gripped her hand tightly, sending her a silent warning. Say nothing, or we lose everything." The crowd waited. The kingdom waited. Would she hold on to the lie, or would the truth finally break free? A heavy silence fell over the palace courtyard. All eyes were on Amara, waiting for her to speak. The king's gaze bore into her, demanding an answer. "If Ugonna is innocent," he repeated slowly, "then who violated you, Amara?" Amara's throat tightened. Her heartbeat pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. This was it. If she continued with the lie, the kingdom would demand Ugonna's exile despite the god's declaration. If she confessed the truth, she would betray her mother and face punishment for deceiving the entire kingdom. Her mother's grip tightened on her wrist, fingers digging into her skin in a silent command. "Do not speak." Amara's hands trembled. The weight of the lie was suffocating her. Her voice cracked. Ugonna piercing gaze never left her. She remembered his kindness. He had never raised a hand against her, never spoken a cruel word. And yet here he was, humiliated, bound like a criminal, his fate hanging by a thread. "Speak, child," one of the elders demanded. Amara squeezed her eyes shut. The walls were closing in. She had to choose. And then she made her choice. She started, voice barely a whisper. I lied." The crowd gasped. Nkem's hand flew over Amara's mouth, but it was too late. The damage was done. The entire courtyard erupted in chaos. "What? She lied?" "The prince is innocent. She tried to frame him." Queen Ugonna fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Relief. Finally, her son's innocence was proven. King Eziobi's fists clenched. His face turned red with rage as he turned to his second wife. "Nkem," he said in a dangerously low voice, "what have you done?" But Nkem was already on her feet, her mask of grief shattering into pure panic. "It was Amara," she blurted out. "She did this on her own. I knew nothing of it." Amara's eyes widened in horror. "Mother?" she whispered, betrayed. Nkem turned to the king, desperate. "She is just a foolish girl. You cannot blame me for the lies of a child." But the kingdom knew better. The elders murmured amongst themselves. The high priest stepped forward, his voice booming over the crowd. "The gods have exposed the wicked. It is now up to the king to decide their punishment." The king's face hardened as he looked at the two women, the wife who had betrayed him, and the daughter who had obeyed her mother's wicked scheme. "Take them both away," he ordered. The guards seized Nkem and Amara. "No, no!" Nkem shrieked, thrashing wildly. "Father, please!" Amara sobbed, guilt consuming her. But there would be no mercy. They had tried to destroy an innocent man, and now justice would be served. As the guards dragged them away, the kingdom erupted into cheers. Cheers for the prince who had suffered but remained victorious. And as Obina's bindings were cut, he stepped forward, looking his father in the eyes. "I will never forget this day, Father." His voice was steady, calm but firm. "And I will never forget who stood by me, and who did not." The palace courtyard remained, tense as the echoes of Nkem and Amara's cries faded into the distance. The crowd had witnessed the unmasking of a great betrayal, but now, all eyes were on King Eziobi as they awaited his final judgment. Ugonna stood tall beside his mother, Queen Ugonna. Though the accusation had been proven false, the scars of the ordeal would not fade easily. He clenched his fists, still feeling the burn of the ropes that had bound him. Justice had to be served. The king rose from his throne, his face a storm of emotions, anger, disappointment, and the weight of a father who had failed to see the deceit growing in his own household. "The gods have spoken," he declared, his deep voice carrying across the palace walls. "Prince Ugonna is innocent. He was wrongfully accused by my second wife and her daughter. For such a crime there must be punishment." The elders nodded in agreement. The high priest stepped forward. King Eziobi, the sacred laws of Umudike Kingdom demand that those who bear false witness face severe consequences. What shall be their fate? The crowd fell silent, waiting for the king's verdict. Nkem fell to her knees, trembling, her proud demeanor shattered. "My king, have mercy," she pleaded, her voice raw with desperation. Amara, her face streaked with tears, bowed her head in shame and fear. But Ugonna spoke before the king could reply. "Mercy?" Ugonna's voice was sharp, filled with the weight of his suffering. He turned to face Nkem, his once beloved stepmother. "Did you show me mercy when you wove your lies? When you sought to ruin my name and destroy my mother?" Nkem could not meet his gaze. "Did you think about mercy?" Ugonna continued, his voice rising. "When you sent your own daughter to falsely accuse me, knowing what my fate would be?" Nkem shook her head weakly, but she had no defense. The king exhaled deeply, then lifted his staff. "For the crime of false accusation," he announced, "Nkem shall be banished from Umudike Kingdom. She will walk the forests alone, never to return." Gasps spread through the crowd. Exile was a fate worse than death. Nkem let out a piercing scream, her body shaking as she collapsed to the ground. "No, my king, please! Have pity, I did it for my son. I only wanted him to rule." But the king's face remained cold. "You have destroyed yourself with your greed." 2 guards stepped forward. Seizing Nkem, she fought against them. But there was no escaping her fate. The king then turned to Amara. "As for you," his voice softened slightly, "you are young, and you were under your mother's influence. But you are not without guilt." Amara fell to the ground, sobbing. "Father, I was afraid. I didn't want to lie. I didn't know what to do." The elders whispered among themselves, debating her punishment. One of them finally spoke. She must not escape judgment, but let her fate be lesser than her mother's. The king nodded. "You will not be exiled, but you shall be stripped of your royal status and sent to serve in the village. As a commoner." Amara's body went limp with despair. "No, please." She had been raised as a princess, surrounded by luxury. Now she would live as a servant among the very people who once bowed to her. It was a fate almost as cruel as her mother's. With the judgment passed, the crowd erupted in cheers, not for the punishment, but for justice. Ugonna looked at his father, his expression unreadable. "The law nearly destroyed me, father," he said quietly. "You believed them without question. If not for the gods, I would be gone, and my mother would be in exile." King Eziobi lowered his head, shame flickering in his eyes. "I have learned from my mistake, my son," he admitted, "and I will never doubt you again." Ugonna nodded, but deep down, he knew that trust, once broken, was never so easily repaired. As the sun began to set over Umudike Kingdom, Nkem was led toward the forest, her wails fading into the distance. Amara was escorted away, her royal garments already being taken from her. And Ugonna? He stood tall, stronger than ever. He had survived betrayal. He had faced falsehood. And soon he would take his rightful place as the king of Umudike. The days passed, and the kingdom of Umudike slowly returned to normal. But nothing would ever be the same. The name Ugonna was no longer just that of the king's son. It was the name of a man who had survived betrayal, who had stood against falsehood, and who had claimed his right not just by birth, but by strength. His mother, Queen Adana, walked with renewed pride, her head held high. She had almost lost everything, but her son's name had been restored. His father, King Eziobi, had learned a hard lesson, one that haunted him in quiet moments. He had doubted his only son, the boy who was meant to rule after him. But Ugonna was no longer just a boy. He was a man forged in the fire of betrayal. The kingdom whispered of his strength, his wisdom, his resilience. They no longer saw just the heir to the throne. They saw their future king. And when the day finally came for Ugonna to ascend the throne, his rule would not be one of weakness. It would be a rule of wisdom, strength, and the unshakable resolve of a man who had already faced the worst and survived.